I reached a point as a teenager that I was a fairly proficient wheelier. However, I never really learned to do it right. I was wheeling on a 1983 XR200R. The XR200 has huge amounts of engine brake, which means that a person can almost completely control a wheelie by modulating the throttle. Give it throttle, front wheel comes up, back off the throttle, and it's braking enough that you'll drop the front tire even if you're beyond balance position. So I never learned to modulate the clutch, never learned to cover the rear brake, always used the throttle to keep the wheelie positioned where I wanted it. Well, the problem with that is if you're riding anything other than an XR200, the engine brake just isn't sufficient. And frankly, if you get well beyond balance point, even the engine brake on an XR200 might not be enough. I've wheelied over way too many two-stroke motorcycles to be very comfortable, and frankly, I still have a little bit of PTSD over it. So here I am now riding a Beta 300, and wheeling it as a two-stroke gets in my head. Like I can't make myself get comfortable in the balance point because I'm so used to using the engine as the brake. Okay, with that little bit of backstory, one of my kids wanted a mountain bike manual trainer. These are readily available online. They're a couple $100. I told him I had enough scrap steel lying around that we could build one in the matter of an hour or so. So we built one, and it worked. He had a good time with it, actually spent some time with his buddies on it. Whether that's improved their skills or not, I don't know, but it was kind of an interesting exercise. I watched that and thought, you know, I'm not trying to do the exact same thing on a motorcycle. It's really not a manual because you're using the engine and the brake to control the height of the wheelie. But I do need something to help me learn to avoid the natural tendency to pull my feet off the pegs to rescue myself, right? Pulling your feet down and putting them on the ground. And instead, keeping my feet in the pilot control position where I can drop the front wheel using the brake regardless of how far over you've gone, right? So it's almost more of an instinct or a muscle memory type of a training problem. So I took the same concept and screwed a bunch of 2x4s and 2x6s and 2x-whatevers together to hold the rear end of the motorcycle in place, and then use some ropes and lifts to put the front wheel in a position where it was at least achievable to get it up in the air, and then find the balance point and train myself to use the right foot to modulate the height of the wheelie. Now, it doesn't quite work because you're not moving, but it does work to retrain the brain, and I'll tell you it did. I went out for a ride after spending probably 30 minutes in 5 or 6 minute increments on the little trainer, got out in the open and out of the gate recognized a difference in my instinct. For example, I was in the parking lot and decided that I would just pop the clutch and head out, recognizing that the ground was wet, and therefore assuming that the wheel would just spin and I would move forward. Well, it grabbed much more than I expected it to. The front end went straight up in the air, beyond balance point, and my feet didn't come off the pegs. They jammed the brake. So the good news is that I've already started to retrain myself instinctually to keep my feet on the pegs. The bad news is that that trainer doesn't really help learn how much brake to give to keep the wheelie where you want it to be. It's kind of a binary braking situation. Bike goes up too high, grab the brake, it's all or nothing. That would, of course, bring the tire back down and the wheelie's over, right? That's interesting and meaningful and a first step. But the long game is to learn how to modulate the brake proportionate to the amount that you want the wheel to move. The next idea was, well, let's take this same concept and make it mobile. I'll call these the wheelie training wheels. And well, I have to say, the idea formulated in my head independently, after doing a little bit of web searching, I learned that this isn't all that terribly unique. These are around. Now, I think most people are overcomplicating the wheelie training wheels. So my objective here is to make something that's really fairly simple. For the most part, using household pieces. These things cost anywhere from $1,500 upwards to nearly $3,000 online, which I can understand because I think they're probably being manually produced. There's not a big enough market to mass produce them, I suspect. But nonetheless, still, it seems like it might be just a tad excessive for something that I think I can provide 90% of what I need out of materials in the shop, and the other 10% is readily accessible here in town. So I grabbed some scrap metal, I used some 1-inch square tubing and a 14 gauge, and pieced some things together. I spent just a little bit of time in the online CAD system and drew things up at 1/10 scale. And while the drawing isn't perfect, it gives me some ideas around what to do, so it's not a complete design build situation. I have a rough idea of where I'm headed, and then if I need to make adjustments on the fly as I cut and weld, I can do so. Now, look, I'm not an expert welder by any stretch, and I know there are other ways to do pie cuts in the steel and maybe get some cleaner finish. I'm not looking for perfection here, I'm looking for completion. So I have a bunch of 1-inch square tubing in 14 gauge steel. I'm complementing that with a handful of things I'm finding around the shop, like the pressure screw from a harmonic balancer puller. I know, right? This is the device that will tighten up against the axle with a conical centering pin into the motorcycle axle. Now I only have one of those, and so I'm gonna have to fashion a second one, or look, you can get these pressure pins with the conical end in just about any puller tool set. Just be a little bit careful because some of them come as a 3/4 inch with a 16 pitch thread. Others come with an M18 and a 1.5 thread. I prefer the 3/4, partially because it's a little bigger, partially because the nuts are easier to find. An M18 by 1.5 is a little more scarce, whereas the 3/4 by 16 is pretty easy to find. So we'll use that out of the tool set. I will probably build another one. I haven't figured out yet how to do the conical shape on the end, but I have some 3/4 inch 16 threaded rod. I found some tires at the Harbor Freight. The regular price is 10 bucks, and I showed up, and what do you know, they were on sale for $5 a piece. So I bought 3 of those at 5 bucks a piece. I will either buy or fashion some turnbuckles for the side supports to be able to adjust those based on the height of the motorcycle and the height of the external wheel. And I'm thinking maybe a piece of plywood across the rear support where a body might land if the bike completely loops out. So look, just not a whole lot of extra stuff or parts going on here. I think I've spent about $50 on a few extra ancillary parts beyond the stuff that I'm able to scrape up here in the shop. So the idea is, look, weld the thing together, a design build-ish. I have some drawings and I don't know how closely I will stick to those drawings. Let's do some cutting and welding. For the most part, I stuck to the original design that I put together. However, I did notice quite quickly a couple of points that are likely to be weak. The first of which is the supports for the bike. These side supports right here naturally get pushed out as you tighten down the spindles around the axle. So these gussets right here are mandatory. I hadn't thought about that until after I'd put things together pretty well. And the round rod that's used to put them together is not by choice. It's just because I'm using what I got left over, and I barely had enough of that. A couple of them are an inch or two shorter than I'd really like them to be, but they'll work. The second point is the joint between the front bracket and the rear support. I wanted this to be separate so that I could take it apart easily, mostly just for mobility and storing. But I knew as soon as this was no longer one continuous piece, I would have a weak point at the joint. So I don't know how much that will matter. In theory, you really never use this unless you fall backward onto the landing pad on your back. So in an ideal world, this joint doesn't matter at all. In reality, I'd like to make sure that it's supplemented enough that it's not going to break on me. So I added a couple of supports to the side. Whether that's enough or not, I don't know, but that should add substantial rigidity and strength to that joint. The third thing is what I'm using as a strut on each of the side supports. These are basic turnbuckles, and while they're fairly heavy duty, they're a 3/8 inch bolt, and rated at 2,200 pounds, that 2,200 pound rating is for tension. These really aren't built for compression, and the way they're being used here is compression. In an ideal world, this would be more like a tie rod off of steering linkage on a car, something to that effect, and you could beef these up fairly easily by maybe putting a pipe or some additional steel around the turnbuckle itself. But I don't expect there to be a whole lot of load on the side, and so I think these will be strong enough. If they're not, they bend, they break, and I'll do something else. But we'll give it a shot anyway. Other than that, the thing came together really quite well. The 1-inch square tube at 14 gauge, I think, is just right. It seems to be strong enough and thick enough to take a good weld, but thin enough that it's still quite light. The little spindles that mount the bike in place worked out quite well. I'll probably manufacture another one of these so I can put this back in the toolkit. I think I used 35, maybe 40 feet of tubing without the gussets on this main bracket. When you add the round rod that I had to put on here, you're pushing 45 feet, I'm guessing, of total metal. 45 feet of square tubing, a couple of spindle, 3/4 inch by 16 threaded rod, 3 wheels from the Harbor Freight at $5 a piece, and a couple of struts wherever you can find them. In the end, depending on what you got sitting around in your shop, you're maybe $100 to build the thing out. Now, I know it needs paint because without it, rust will set in pretty quickly. But before I paint it, I think it needs to be tested. Whew. It feels really stable, so that's encouraging. We do need a guinea pig, though. Hey, Spencer!
That's definitely 4-stroke versus 2-cycle. Holy! Eddie! That's not funny. Wow.
It works though. It provides the confidence that you need. It eliminates the sideways balancing, so you think just about the up-down balancing, and you can largely stop thinking about falling over backward. Nice and slow. Not bad though. That's fun. Thank you.
Yeah.